Thank you for joining us today to talk about improving attitudes towards disability in Canada. I want to begin by acknowledging some of the people and organizations that have assisted in this work and funded it and supported it to make it possible. Some of you may have known my husband Kirby Rowe, who was a committed advocate for people with disabilities, and he very often used the immortal words of Al Capone to illustrate the need not only for legislation, not only for good attitudes towards disability, but also for enforceable legislation to ensure access and inclusion of people with disabilities. Today, we're on the cusp of being closer than we've ever been before to having that enforceable legislation. But the Government of Canada says that's not enough. We also need to cultivate a culture that is welcoming and inclusive towards people with disabilities. In their own words, from their white paper entitled, "What Does an Accessible Canada Mean to You?" the Government of Canada says that legislation on its own is only part of the answer. Accessibility has to be a part of our everyday thinking. How can we raise awareness and change attitudes, both in the short term and the long term? What collaborative models have led to a sustained culture change within organizations in relation to disability? That's what we're here to talk about today. How can we address attitudes towards disability so that Canadians aren't just doing the right thing for the wrong reason, but understand the importance of attitudes towards disability and are upholding the legislation, upholding their responsibility towards all Canadians, and doing so in a spirit of inclusion and accessibility. Let's begin by saying what we mean by attitudes, because attitudes are a very particular thing. An attitude is a learned idea. In other words, we're not born with our attitudes. Our attitudes grow out of our socialization and our experience. We learn them from our parents, from our peers, from the media, even from strangers. An attitude is a response towards a person, place, or thing. In other words, an attitude has an object. In the case of attitudes towards disability, the object of attitudes is people with disabilities. And I don't mean by saying that to objectify people with disabilities in any way, shape, or form, just that they are the target of attitudes towards disabilities. The other thing that's important to understand about attitudes is that they include an element of evaluation. That evaluation can be either positive or negative, but it's inevitably detectable. An attitude communicates an evaluation positively or negatively towards the object or the person, place, or thing that the attitude is directed towards. Why do we have attitudes? Attitudes typically serve four purposes. First of all, in a sort of utilitarian sense, attitudes stream our decision-making by providing us with an instantaneous summary judgment of our thoughts and experience about a particular person, place, or thing. Secondly, attitudes provide a structure to help us assimilate incoming knowledge, a filing system to help us have a home for new information as it comes to our attention. Thirdly, attitudes uphold our sense of ourself. They're a part of our identity, and they reinforce or validate who we are to ourselves. And finally, attitudes communicate to others who we are and what we believe in often in just a glance or an expression, but sometimes also in words. Attitudes are made up of both a thought and a feeling. The cognitive aspect of attitudes exists in the cerebral cortex, in the new brain. It's an idea that can be expressed using language, and it is within our control. In other words, it's subject to some degree of logic or reason. The other part of attitudes, the emotional part, is a feeling, a reaction, an impulse. It's formed in the old brain. And what we know about the old brain is that it was designed specifically for the purposes of survival and reproduction. The old brain is involuntary, instinctive, drive-oriented. It operates very, very quickly in apparently 1/20th of the time that it takes to form a thought in the new brain. So you can see that in order to effectively address attitudes, we have to address both the thoughts and the feelings, that instantaneous impulse that happens when we encounter the object of our attitudes, and also the conscious thought that we form that is expressible in language, but that takes a considerable amount of time longer, up to 2 seconds, to form the cognitive portion of an attitude. The other thing that it's important for us to understand about attitudes is that we carry with us both explicit and implicit attitudes. Explicit attitudes are those that we express consciously, those that we are aware of and we are willing to tell other people and let them know how we feel about certain things. Implicit attitudes are those that we are less likely to attach words to. They are those that we harbor and express, whether we know it or not, but we are less aware of them, less conscious of the way they shape our ideas and behavior. In order to change attitudes, we need to get beneath explicit attitudes and address implicit attitudes as well. And we'll talk in just a moment about some ways to do that. So armed with that understanding of what attitudes are and what we mean when we talk about attitudes, the Rick Hansen Institute commissioned a survey a few years ago by Angus Reid to look at attitudes towards disability in Canada. And they came up with these 4 categories of people, each of whom has different types of attitudes towards disability. The first group that they described was the group that they called those who are on side. And they constituted 34% of the population, people who cared deeply about disability issues. So when you think about this 34%, it's probably made up of the, 14, 15, 16% of people who we know in Canada have a disability based on the Canada Survey on Disability in 2012. And it probably also includes the people that those 14, 15% live with or are closely attached to. So these people know what we mean when we talk about attitudes towards disability, and they're committed to disability issues. The next group is called the Young Bystander Group, and they're made up of 28% of the population. They are idealistic about disability rights and about rights in general, but somewhat disengaged from disability issues. They probably don't have specific reference points for disability issues. They probably don't have any first-hand or even second-hand experience with disability. They're probably somewhat at arm's length of people with disabilities, but they believe in the ideal of access and inclusion. The third group is called the older detached group, making up 25% of the population. They are more aware of disability issues, probably by virtue of their age and their increasing contact with disability, either in themselves or in their contemporaries. But they don't feel like disability issues are their issues. They are somewhat distanced from disability issues, or detached, as the label says, from disability issues. The fourth category, thankfully making up only 15% of the population, are what the survey called indifferent. They say that access is a nice idea, inclusion is a nice idea, but it's not a right. And particularly if it's going to cost me anything, I'm not that interested. So the indifferent group are the most detached from disability issues and probably the least amenable to forming positive attitudes towards disability. So who among these four groups of people is our primary audience when we seek to change attitudes towards disability, and how do we reach them? The conventional wisdom on any kind of change is that there's usually groups at the extremes, just like we have here, the on-side group who are already on board and don't need to have their attitudes changed, and the what we call the indifferent group in this survey, who really are not interested, who don't get it, who don't want to get it, who are probably never going to get it. And are we really going to spend our time on that group? Then in the middle, there's this 50% who could be influenced towards the positive side, who are probably our best bet in terms of making real, measurable, important change towards attitudes. If you've read Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point, he suggests that only 10% of the population needs to embrace an idea in order for that to have ripple effects and make a significant change. So my suggestion to us as we think about changing attitudes is that we focus on these folks in the middle, the young bystanders and the older detached, as being the most amenable to helping to make wide-scale change towards positive attitudes towards disability. Let's talk a little bit about Canadian attitudes towards disability and what we're actually dealing with as we confront the idea of changing attitudes. The first idea that characterizes Canadian attitudes towards disability is an idea that Michael Prince from the University of Victoria calls the Pride and Prejudice approach. He says that in Canada we're very proud of how progressive Canada is in the country, as a country, the progress that we've made towards inclusion in recent years. And yet, despite this proud feeling, where 92% of Canadians say, yes, of course accessibility is a human right, only 50% think that it should be a priority, and only 40% think that disability accommodations are a worthwhile expenditure. So the message that I take from this in thinking about changing attitudes is that we have to be very specific with people. We have to approach disability attitudes in context and get personal, really dig beneath people's explicit attitudes and dig down into the implicit attitudes, the ones that they don't necessarily readily share. Because Canadians know what to say, they know what the right attitudes are, but they very often say, well, yes, but that doesn't necessarily apply to me. So the take-home message from this idea is to get personal and get specific. Another finding about Canadian attitudes towards disability is that they are dualistic, that they're polarized, that we look at people as either disabled or non-disabled, normative or non-normative. And that big group of disabled sort of throws together all people who have disabilities, despite how heterogeneous the category of disability is and despite the different needs that people with different kinds of disabilities have. The other dualistic tendency that we have in Canada and beyond is to what one author calls lionize or demonize disability, to describe a person with a disability as a hero, as an inspiration, as a wonder, or to completely disregard people with disabilities. And so I think those kinds of generalities don't really do us any favors in addressing attitudes. And instead, I suggest that what we need to do is to embrace the subtlety of disability, to get specific about what people need and how we can ensure that it's available for them. The other thing that I think this slide suggests to us is that it's helpful to turn down the emotion, to not engage in inflamed rhetoric about heroes and inspirations, but rather to realize that people are people and we all wanted to be treated with dignity and respect, and to treat disability as a fact of life and not as a hero narrative. The third quality that has been described about Canadian attitudes towards disability is that they are somewhat paradoxical. In the absence of knowing what to do in terms of making processes and premises more accessible for people with disabilities, we tend to make two kinds of mistakes. We either over-attribute to the disability or under-attribute. Over-attribution means that we see the disability as the key feature of the person and we attribute everything to their disability. We assume that everything about them flows from their disability, and that is the foremost thing about them that we need to address. On the other side is under-attribution, and it typically occurs in the absence of knowing what to do. We say, well, what would we do for someone who didn't have a disability? And so maybe the best thing that we can do is to treat the person with a disability as though they didn't have it, and that's the best way to be fair. I think the take-home message here is that we have to help people to know what to do, to help them to avoid these two extremes of mistakes, over-attribution and under-attribution, to be specific with them about how to accommodate and how to adjust their processes and their spaces to be more inclusive to people with disabilities. I think we have to assume that they genuinely want to know and to help them to know what to do. The final aspect of attitudes towards disabilities is stereotypes. And stereotypes are preconceived notions about individuals or groups that take one characteristic and on the basis of that one characteristic, attribute a whole constellation of other characteristics. In this case, it's the disability that's the one characteristic. And what happens with disability stereotypes is people assume that because a person has a disability, a whole bunch of other qualities can be attributed to them. Qualities about their cognitive, emotional, physical, social abilities. And instead of getting specific and understanding the specific needs of the person, people make assumptions that because of the disability, they know more than they actually know about the person. The troublesome thing about stereotypes is that they are usually subconscious. We usually only become aware of them when they're challenged. They usually oversimplify reality, and they're very often somewhat fixed in people's consciousness. So our challenge is to avoid these extremes, to challenge stereotypes, and to treat people as individuals with individual specific needs. I'm going to invite you to do an exercise with me that helps people to understand their own attitudes towards disability. And so there's a PDF available with this template on it, and if you have access to it, now's the time to pull it out. If you don't, you can just do this on a blank piece of paper. So I'm going to ask you to fill in those columns one by one, and then we'll see where we get with it. All right. In column A, I'm going to invite you to write down the name or initials or something that will help you to know who you're talking about. To write down the name of 5 people you know that you consider to have a disability of one kind or another. I'm not going to stop and give you time to do each of these steps in this tape because You can stop the tape and do it if you wish, but write down the names of 5 people that you know that you consider to have a disability. Under column B, write down what you consider to be each person's most significant disability. I'm not going to suggest a definition or a taxonomy of disability to you. I'm going to ask you to use your intuitive definition and whatever language you have at your disposal. You don't have to share this exercise with anyone. It's just for yourself. So use whatever language is comfortable to you and reminds you of what you meant for each person's disability of those 5 people. And obviously you can see now that if you choose 5 people that you know quite well, it's helpful in terms of being able to characterize his or her disability. In column C, I'm going to ask you to rate each person's disability on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 meaning their disability hardly affects them at all, and 10 meaning their disability severely affects almost every aspect of their life. So I'm going to ask you to rate their disability in terms of how significantly it affects each person's life. So in column C, you will have 5 numbers between 1 and 10. In column D, I'm going to ask you to write down your own name 5 times. In column E, write down what you consider to be your most significant disability 5 times. And in column F, rate what you consider to be your own most significant disability on the same scale. 1 hardly affects me at all. 10 affects almost every aspect of my life very significantly. The same number 5 times in each space of column F. All right, now we're going to subtract column C from column F. So in each of the 5 spaces under total, I've called it column G on the slide, but total on the form, I'm going to ask you to write the difference between column C and column F. So F minus C. And then total up those values in column G or in the final column, and total them up with their sign. So you want to note if they have a positive or negative sign. And you will come up with a single summary score at the bottom of column G. This exercise was designed by Beatrice Wright, who is they call her the parent of rehab psychology. And she published a book in 1961 called Rehabilitation Psychology, and this exercise comes from that book. She has done this exercise with a number of different audiences and has found that overwhelmingly audiences tend to come up with a summary score that is a negative value. So what does it mean to have a negative value? A negative value on this exercise means that you judge other people's disabilities to be more troublesome than your own. And even when she's had audiences made up of people who had very significant disabilities, they still judged other people's disabilities to be more troublesome than their own. So we think for a moment about the reason for that, and what she suggests is the reason is that people look at other people's disabilities without any understanding of the coping skills and the resources that people marshal over a lifetime with a disability, over a period of time with a disability, to help them get through their life. When we look at other people's disabilities, we don't have that knowledge of those coping strategies or resources. Whereas when we evaluate our own disability, we evaluate it in the context of knowing how we deal with it. And so the take-home message from this exercise is to recognize that we probably don't see other people's disabilities in a value-neutral way. And so we all carry attitudes, regardless of how experienced we are, regardless of how familiar we are with disability, we all carry attitudes about how positive or negative it is to live with a disability. And one of the things that we will talk about in this process of changing attitudes is how to remove some of that positive or negative evaluation and instead treat disability as a value-neutral commodity. Commodity is not the best word, but as a value-neutral issue that simply requires us to respond in a human positive way. Before we go any further, I'm going to talk for a couple of moments about what works and what doesn't work in terms of changing attitudes towards disability. But I'd like you to write down what you think of as the two most commonly used strategies when you try to imagine changing people's attitudes towards disabilities. I suspect that they are these first two that I'm going to share with you. And unfortunately, what we've learned is that they don't work. The first one that usually comes to people's mind is public awareness campaigns, whether or not it's public service announcements, billboards, social media campaigns, portraying positive images of people with disabilities. I'm going to suggest that positive images of people with disabilities in the media are a necessary but not sufficient condition for attitude change. We obviously want to see positive attitudes, but they don't necessarily in and of themselves change people's minds about disability. Public awareness campaigns allow people to distance themselves from the message and allow people to say, well, of course I believe the right thing, but it doesn't dig deep enough to get personal and say, yes, of course you do know the right thing to say, but do you act on it? Does your company hire people with disabilities? Does your organization account for the possibility of people with disabilities joining? Does your workplace welcome people with disabilities? So public awareness campaigns, unfortunately, aren't enough to change attitudes. The other thing that people very often think of as a way to change attitudes towards disability is simulations. And you may want to think to yourself, if you've ever had the experience of, spend a day in a wheelchair, or go around for a day with blackout sunglasses, or with headphones, noise-canceling headphones on to simulate physical or sensory disabilities. The problem with simulations is that they have that same impact of showing you what it's like to encounter the world with a disability, but not giving you the opportunity to develop any coping strategies or have any supports in accessing the world or accessing your way of life with a disability. And so what very often happens with simulations is they leave people horrified at the prospect of having a disability. And they leave them with the memory of the frustration and the alienation and just the sheer difficulty of getting through their normal daily routines. But what they fail to account for is that people who live with a disability have all kinds of strategies and ingenuity and resourcefulness to be able to deal with those situations. And they've spent, weeks, months, years cultivating those resources. So simulations are critiqued for very often backfiring and leaving people with a negative impression of what it's like to live with a disability, and further adding to the negativity of attitudes towards disability and layering negative emotion onto the situation of people with disabilities. The literature is very clear about what does work. It converges on 3 or 4 different things, and I'm going to tell you about each of them. But the first and foremost one is contact. Over and over again, the literature has shown that the more contact people have with people with disabilities, the better able they are to relate to the situation of people with disabilities, and to do the 2 things that we seek in changing attitudes: to decrease social anxiety and to increase empathy. The contact can be brief and indirect. It's best if it's contextual, if it happens in a real life situation, and it's also best if it focuses on strategies and resourcefulness. There was an example in the literature of an accessibility audit at a university where disabled students were paired with non-disabled students to go around the university identifying where there were barriers to access. So the non-disabled students saw the disabled students in their real world, interacting with others, engaging with the campus as it exists. They became aware of the barriers, but they also became aware of the resourcefulness and ingenuity of their disabled colleagues in dealing with the barriers, and also seeing some of the resources that are available to them, some of the pieces that can be put in place on campus, for example, to support students with disabilities. Another strategy that works is what they call co-participation, and typically focusing on sport and leisure, active living. There's good evidence to show that a strengths-based fun activity goes a long way to creating positive attitudes towards disability. So we see not just the challenges and the difficulties of living with a disability, but the fact that it's possible to lead a full, engaged life with a disability, and to have some fun and have an active, healthy lifestyle. Another strategy that's been shown to work, although you may feel that it's for the wrong reasons, is monetary incentives. They create contact. We said before that contact is the most important thing in terms of improving attitudes. Rewards and incentives, very often to employers, create that opportunity for contact. It may feel like it amounts to doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, but as long as people do the right thing, then what they discover from these incentives is that there are real benefits to having people with disabilities in our midst, in the workplace or in the community, and that the costs, in fact, are inconsequential. I think sometimes people use costs as a way of saying, oh, we couldn't possibly do that in our setting because the costs would be prohibitive. What they find, in fact, when they do attempt to accommodate a specific person to be in their environment is that the costs are considerably less than they would have expected. Another strategy for which there is excellent support in the literature is focusing on young people. Attitudes are formed in early childhood, and rather than having to unlearn established or entrenched attitudes, if we focus on youth, we have the opportunity to create positive attitudes right from the start, and to raise young people who don't see the disability first, who rather see the person first, and who, as we've said repeatedly today, who take some of the emotion out of the encounter with a person with disability and simply encounter them as a person. Another strategy that has been shown to be remarkably effective is to focus on health professionals. Health professionals constitute only a small part of the population, but they play an important role in people's lives. Not only that, but we actually have their attention, at least for the time while they're students or trainees. Health professionals have been shown to hold very problematic biases towards people with disabilities, to medicalize disability and to see disability only in a very particular way. And when we have their attention as students, there's a marvelous opportunity to cultivate positive attitudes. Finally, a strategy called discrepancy awareness or meta-awareness has been shown to be a very positive way of changing disabilities. But in order to do discrepancy awareness, you have to catch people out at their bad attitudes or at their biases. And so you have to put them in a situation where they are bound to demonstrate an implicit attitude that they're not aware of and then catch them out. So there are certain simulations that are possible. For example, one year when I was teaching, I had a small group of about 15 and they sat in the same orientation in every class. And one day I came in and switched all the chairs around and told the students that we had had a request from one of the other students in the room with a disability to reorient the chairs to accommodate his or her disability. And I then told them that in fact that wasn't true. It was just an exercise that I had done, but asked them to note for themselves their reactions to that. And that they didn't need to tell anybody else, but I urged them to be honest with themselves about their personal sense of being asked to do things differently in order to accommodate one person. And I think that we need to be able to be honest with ourselves and with others about the fact that we don't always respond well when we're asked to change the way we've always done things. It's one of the pieces of changing attitudes that we have to confront if we're going to make a difference. Finally, I want to just re-emphasize the two aims that we're seeking when we seek to change attitudes towards disability. We want to increase empathy, increase our sense of understanding and awareness of what people with disabilities in our midst need. And secondly, to decrease social anxiety, so decrease the fear and the stress of not knowing what to do when we have people with disabilities in our midst. And these things are typically done, there's an acronym here, PEARL, through partnership, empowerment, respect, and listening. So in summary, the main messages that I think come from the literature and are well supported by the evidence for changing attitudes towards disability are the following. To focus on the middle 50% who are amenable to change and who we have the opportunity to sway towards positive attitudes. To address both thoughts and feelings. To get personal, to go beyond explicit attitudes and dig down to implicit attitudes. To avoid extremes or caricatures, to de-emphasize the emotion and deal with disability as a reality, as an everyday reality for many people. To help people to know what to do, to understand that attitudes and behavior are linked, but they're not the same. People want to know what to do, and if we can make that simple for them and help them to understand what to actually do, then very often attitudes will follow. And finally, the best thing that we can do is to promote contact and dialogue. Thank you for your interest and attention today, and I urge you to share these ideas and to raise the questions and talk about the issues and work together to create a Canada that is more inclusive and accessible to all. Thank you.